Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yurachek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is JB from NextSense, and he's developing an EEG wearable, essentially headphones, and these help you sleep. We've been having a good amount of auricular stim and ear-based stims lately this year. I don't know what's going on, what's in the water. But anyways, JB, do you want to introduce yourself better than I just did?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me. It's great to be on this podcast. I love talking about an area of focus for about the last 10 years of my life. So just a little bit of background. I was academically a philosophy and religious study major, spent a long time in business in various roles. But about 10 years ago, I got the itch while I was at Google, who is famous for encouraging 20% projects. I did a little bit more than that when I teamed up with a buddy and we pitched a moonshot. And that was based on a mentor of mine giving me a paper that showed through audio stimulation in the middle of the night in a certain phase of sleep that you could perhaps enhance deep sleep. And so we crafted that into a moonshot pitch of, hey, what if you could sleep 6 hours, but actually have the brain get restored like 8 hours? And Google liked that. And that's when the whole pivot to this passion play of mine happened about 10 years ago.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so you were within Google and then you were just able to take that IP, take that idea and leave. They didn't have any restrictions on that, or how did that work?
Of course, there were lots of T's to cross, I's to dot, but yeah, so they did fund the program at Google, and we did that for about 2.5, 3 years. And then I guess the program started with enhancing sleep, okay? And then it took a few twists and turns. Ultimately, we put it inside of an epilepsy clinic, mostly just to validate that you could get EEG from the ear. There were a few papers out back in 2016, 2017 timeframe, but nothing that Google felt confident in. They're like, okay, we need our own first principle research. And so we put it into epilepsy monitoring clinic at Emory, and we're able to get seizures in the ear. And that was a really big milestone to achieve. But ultimately, when COVID happened, they started shutting projects down left and right. And so I did pitch to them, hey, what if I went outside of Google, I got funding, and then would you spin the technology in? And that was a new model for them. They really hadn't done that prior to NextSense. There was a few programs like Malta and Dandelion, but they were massive investments. One day a Google project, and then the next day an Alphabet company. And that's not what NextSense was. We weren't trying to be an Alphabet company. We didn't have that ambition. And so I was able to convince them. But it did come with a few strings. For example, I could not sell the company for the first 3 years.
Interesting. Yeah. So you were so convinced with this. Did you give up the Google job, or because they have free bagels and stuff like this? How do you say no to?
They have a lot of free stuff and very good stock options. Yes, it was hard. I think at the time, maybe it's good. You have a little bit of naivete, and maybe all entrepreneurs need some naivete to jump off the deep end. But yeah, I had to lay it all aside with no guarantees that I would get funding, no guarantees that Google would actually do what they said. I literally left with a piece of paper signed from Astro Teller saying, hey, JB's a good guy. There's some good, interesting IP. Here's a PowerPoint that you can show the confidential data that you collected. And if you get funding, we most likely will put the technology into the company. So a lot of hand waving, but it was the right shared risk model. I was taking a risk to leave Google, put my badge on the table, no way of coming back other than being rehired. And then I had to find a VC who was willing to put money in, but it had to have NextSense had to stand on its own prior to getting the Google IP. So the way we did that, I had already been in touch with 3 different labs. There were 3 main labs doing serious ear EEG research: Imperial College of London with Daniela Mendich and Preben Kidmose in our house, and then Gert Kammerberg at UCSD. And so I went to UCSD and I said, hey, I'm really interested in ear EEG. I need to get some IP into the company. What do you have? And they had a very interesting neural interface system on a chip. So basically this integrated circuit, this ASIC designed just for EEG. and could be used for ear EEG. They also did it for implanted EEG. And so I licensed that. And so we were really a UCSD spin out prior to an X spin out, but that was by design. We needed to have real IP and a real valuation that a VC could fund that did not include the Google IP. Once we had that, then we could go to Google and say, hey, we're a real company. We've got real IP. Now will you spin that technology in? And they agreed to it, which was, looking back, amazing. And we did start more, but they liked that process. They're like, oh, this kind of works. Let's do that more. And so now there's been many of those spin outs.
Yeah, cool. Wait, so I might have missed it. Why did you decide to spin it out versus keeping it in Google? Obviously, if you had it kept in Google, they have a lot more resources. They might kill the project. They're notorious for that. But yeah.
Yeah, they pretty much did kill the project at X. They told me in June of 2020. During COVID, they started shutting projects down. And they're like, hey, you've got 3 months. You can try to land this project inside of Google. So you could go to Google Health. You could pitch it. Maybe they want to fund it. Or you could go to Verily and pitch it. Maybe they want to fund it. And I was like, if I'm going to do that, I might as well leave and just take it with me. So I really wanted the autonomy. I wanted to take it my own direction. When I have a lot of respect for the folks at X, and obviously the project wouldn't exist if it weren't for them, but it was clear they had their own designs on it, right? A lot of the direction I was getting at Google was to build a platform that was beyond the phone. That didn't necessarily have direct health benefits. They did not want me to go after seizures, for example. We got seizure data, but that was more just to validate. That wasn't ever to build a seizure detection or seizure forecasting device. They just thought, oh, this will be a way to validate it. And then what else could you do with it that would be very cool? Could you determine what somebody was listening to and then enhance that experience once you knew what they were listening to, as just one example? So we had to come up with all those things. And I just felt like that was fine because they were paying the bills. But if I had my own company, then I could figure out what I was passionate about and I could go after that myself.
Got it. Okay, so what is the technology? EEG from the ear. Usually you wear this on your scalp, right? You have some electrodes and you have some sticky gel that you put on, and you have to maybe even shave your head to be able to get good signals. And then you're still reading through the skull and the scalp and different layers that aren't necessarily helping with the neural signal. Why the ear? How does that work even?
Yeah, so it really is just like another scalp location. In fact, when we were submitting for FDA review, we found some old textbooks that actually had T9 and T10 that were pretty much inside the ear cavity. If you think about it, all the neural activity is happening inside in the cortex, and there's the skull that is surrounding it. As it turns out, there is less of that matter when you go in through the ear canal than if you put it on side of your temple, for say, or even right above your ear. And so that means you have less skull matter that is attenuating the signal. And so that is good in many ways. Now, that said, you still have a very faint signal. So I don't want to say that inside the ear is better than scalp, or that it does have some advantages because the canal itself is almost like a Faraday cage. You can get less artifact that's coming in because it's a bit protected. So it does have some of those advantages. We think it has a lot of advantages in that you just can slip it in, but you're not getting the same spatial resolution as you would with scalp. It may take 30 minutes to set up, and you might be scraping the dead skin cells and putting gel on, and that's a pain in the butt. But you are getting a resolution that you'll never get by just putting 2 earbuds in. But you do get the comfort, you get the convenience, and thanks to some of the IP we have, we actually get really low resistance. So some of our core IP is this conductive layer that coats the ear tips that then translates the electrical stimulation from the neurons into the actual earbud itself. Yeah.
Does earwax have any effect? It's like pre-coated, pre-lubricated, something like that.
Yeah, it has mostly negative effects. So we have a signal check on our device, and when it's failing and it's because of that, we know that if the ear tips are relatively new, the ear tips last about 30 uses, 30 nights. And if somebody is saying, "Oh, mine's already failing signal check after 4 times," we have to politely tell them, like, "Oh, you might want to clean those ear tips and wings because of the earwax." Yeah.
Wow. Okay. You were studying different things before while at Google and like listening to audio and the signals there. So, but then when you got your own autonomy and freedom, then you went after sleep. Why sleep especially?
I think that it's a massive problem, first of all. I think many people over various time periods, but even across cultures, struggle with either getting enough sleep, so that making that sleep really efficient, or staying asleep. A lot of sleep fragmentation happens post 50s. And then we know that there's so many both daytime disabilities that come from poor sleep, whether that is clinical problems like narcolepsy, literally falling asleep unexpectedly, but just daytime sleepiness and drowsiness is affecting at least 10 to 15% of the world's population. So it's a massive problem, number one. Number two, it's always been a passion area for me. That part of the way I got into the project was having a mentor in the field of dreaming, actually. That was his background, and a lot of my focus and research has been in the dreaming space, but sleep is at the core, right? So that I think is one. And then two, we did have this opportunity to enhance sleep that was super novel. Like when Dr. Stephen LaBerge gave me that paper in 2017, very few people were focused on this idea of enhancing sleep. Tracking sleep was very popular. You had the Oura Ring had just come out, and you had Fitbit before that, and the Nike Fuel Band. So everything was tracking sleep. But 10 years ago, modulating sleep was very new. And I would argue even now, there's very few devices that are claiming to do something to your sleep besides just track it like a ring or a band. So I think it was a combination of, hey, it's a massive problem. And two, I've been given some research that showed you might be able to engineer a solution that is taking what is already an amazing process that evolution has given us and making it 10 to 15% better. That just seemed to be too good to pass up.
Yeah. So it's not like you put them on and you fall asleep right away. You're saying 10 to 15%. So not so drastic that it's maybe dangerous to operate heavy machinery while wearing these, right?
No, that's right. And we are finding people that are falling asleep much faster with them. But the let me explain a little bit of the core science of the buds. And we didn't invent the science. I do think that we engineered it in the smallest form factor possible. But the science shows, and this goes back to people like Tononi and Nago's research, that when the brain is in a certain phase of sleep, N3 or deep sleep, there's these slow oscillations that are happening. And it's mostly because there's these cortical round trips of various functional areas of the brain, and they're consolidating memories, they're cleaning the waste and doing other important things. But the rhythms are very slow because you have many neurons recruited to work at the same time. And so that's you pick up on these half a hertz oscillations to 1 hertz. These are called slow oscillations. You have the overall deep sleep is typically 1 hertz to 4 hertz. So when you're in that realm, the science showed for about 10 years, and this has been replicated across many labs, that if you put in stimulation, most of the stimulation has been pink noise, these small little bursts, about 50 milliseconds, at the certain phase of the wave. So they even figured out if the down phase or the up phase made a difference. You phase lock it, then it enhances the amplitude and even the duration of the slow oscillations. That then, most of the studies, including the one that we did at Google, then goes to the next day. How did you perform on cognitive memory tests? Because deep sleep is associated with cognitive memory, then what is the impact of that stimulation versus a sham condition, right? Where you are not actually stimulating. And so that's what was fascinating. We were able to replicate the research that had been done. We could show a 10 to 15% increase in declarative memory the next day for stim conditions versus sham. And that's the key, right? Is this isn't a placebo effect. This is because this was blinded. They did not know if they'd been stemmed or not. And so then you have these memory tests that are showing a 10 to 15% increase. You actually saw higher in terms of slow wave activity. So the mean that we saw was 22% increase in slow wave activity, but that translated into about a 10 to 15% boost in memory performance the next day.
Wow. Crazy. That's so. Do you know the mechanism of action? Have you guys looked into that, or just you see the effect that's good enough?
Yeah, it's like pharmaceuticals, right? They often don't know the mechanism of action either. The best explanation that I've heard came from Phyllis E., one of our PIs, original PIs from the lab. And she has a pretty good hypothesis on this that I'm happy to share with you and with the audience. It's that it's not so much the pink noise itself. There's nothing magical about that waveform. It has more to do with the autonomic nervous system before sleep. And we did measure that before sleep, during sleep, and after sleep. And we found that those folks that were in more of a rest and digest parasympathetic activation versus sympathetic fight or flight, if they were less activated when they went to sleep and then these bursts came, it's almost there's a part of the brain that was saying, you know what, I'm in a safe environment, I'm not feeling threatened, but something's trying to wake me up and I don't want to be awake. I'm going to actually go deeper. Inception. Let's go to level 3. Let's go to level 4. And then at that deeper level, even more cleaning can happen, even more memory consolidation can happen because we're in a deeper stage of sleep. Because we found for those people that went to bed a little bit more vigilant, right? Maybe you had a tough day and you got to the sleep lab because you said you were going to do this study and you're not super excited to be there because you're wondering if your grant's going to get proposed or if you wonder this is going to happen. If they went more activated, we saw less effect, right? We did not see that. And that's almost like the brain's, hey, I don't know if I'm in a good environment. I'm feeling slightly threatened. If a noise comes in, oh, I might want to wake up. And so we tried to titrate the algorithm and the noise level of the pink noise burst such that it would not wake people up. But we did find that variability. We found some people that had massive effect, 40, 50% boost in slow wave activity. And then we had some that showed almost none. And then so we had to dig into the data to find out like, this is something that can predict whether or not they were going to have effective stimulation. And honestly, that was the piece we were missing at Google. So that's something we found post Google at NextSense that gives us more confidence in the solution that we're shipping. Because to be honest, one of the things that put the project on ice at X was this variability without really any of the institutional willpower to go find out why. But I was able to spin that data set out. We were able to look at it, and a researcher at Emory found that and actually has submitted for publication a paper right on the findings of this.
Yeah, interesting. And did you look at the same people on a stress day versus not a stress day, something like that? Or are some people just high strung and always going to be having that
it was a
issue?
crossover study. So we basically had 3 nights of sleep. We had a baseline, we had a stim, and we had a sham. And then it was randomized crossover. So I think it was just the natural, we couldn't control for it. We didn't have that insight. So we only had to see that after the fact, where we, like most research, you have a few hypotheses and you get something, and then you're like, why did that happen? Let's look and see if there's a plausible explanation. And then, of course, a follow-up study, you could try to control for that, which we do plan to do now that we have earbuds. We can do it at scale. That's what's exciting is we don't have to pull people into the clinic. We have an IRB that we've submitted for the consumer device such that people can just, when they're onboarding, they can accept to be a part of the study or not. And we plan to collect 10,000 nights of sleep and see how does that affect. And we also have an Apple Health Kit integration. So if people are wearing a watch or ring or something else, we don't have to just use our own data. It'd be nice to validate that on a different device against baseline, right? When you onboard, if you use the smart buds, or if any of your listeners decide to get the NextSense smart buds and you have an Apple device, we'll bring in like a year's worth of your data. And then you can really see, hey, did these smart buds do something? Am I getting more deep sleep as registered by my watch, as registered by my ring? And so we think that's really fascinating, and that should lead to a good paper.
Wow. Yeah. So you have the hardware now, and you've also said that you engineered your way into this solution that it already existed. So yeah, tell us about the hardware. What does it look like? Why is it difficult? Haven't people made earbuds before?
Yeah, they've made a lot of earbuds, but making them read the brain waves in such a small form factor is really tough. So yeah, it looks like a regular pair of earbuds. They sound great. We use some manufacturers in China that worked on other high-end earbuds so that we would have really good audio tuning. So first and foremost, they're earbuds. You can listen to music on them. You can do a podcast. You can take a phone call. It's got a microphone. They're earbuds, first and foremost. Second, we designed them to be small enough such that you could sleep with them. Unlike some people do sleep with AirPods, but they stick out. And for most people, these do not stick out and they're flush. And so they can be comfortable while you are side sleeping or back sleeping or however you like to sleep. They have accelerometer in there, they have a gyrometer in there, and then they have the EEG analog front end so that we can take the neural signals from the canal and then process it through the chip and then Bluetooth to the phone. And then we run the algorithms on the phone, not in the cloud, because we believe in kind of data privacy. And you can do all kinds of cool stuff with that. Like you can see this different sleep stages. Okay, you can do that with a ring and a watch. What else? You could actually count the slow waves. So we just thought that would be, maybe that's the Fitbit metric of the brain. When Fitbit came out, everybody's, oh, do I have my 10,000 steps? We have actual slow waves. I had 600 and some slow waves last night. And what we're finding, that metric is so interesting to people because then they want to say, how do I get more of that? How do I get better sleep? And we found one interesting thing in the data that we can only explain by the fact that once people have something they can measure, they try to manage it, right? And so what we found is people started to go to sleep at the same time and wake up at the same time. Now, that wasn't an overt recommendation that we're making in the app, but it's pretty easy to find that advice on the internet of, hey, how do I improve my sleep? Or how do I get better deep sleep? One of the suggestions, hey, go to bed at the same time and wake up at the same time. And indeed, our power users are doing that. And I think it's because they have a metric that they can now finally manage. And I know all these trackers have scores. They have a sleep score, but I think there's something tangible about this is measuring a brainwave. This isn't a black box number. I had 600 last night. I had 400 that night. I had some alcohol and it went down to 100. There's something very tangible about this is your brain activity. This isn't a band or a ring estimating your heart, which is then estimating the brain state. It is directly to the brain state. And I think people really like that. And then also, it's boosting that number. So you can see in the UI where if you got boost that night, which you can turn it on or turn it off, but most people leave it on, it shows when the algorithm felt like now is the time to boost, it shows in pink, like where these little points of boost were. And they don't wake you up. You're oblivious to it, but it then is enhancing that number of waves. So I think that's what people like about the solution is that it isn't just another tracker. It really is trying to intervene, and it's intervening primarily through the slow waves.
Yeah, that is pretty exciting. You're right. It is more quantifiable. It's less like a black box and more like how many number of steps you have. EEGs are very noisy, and then you have a consumer device, and then people have to place them themselves. And how noisy is this? How good is the signal? How much? I know the Ring and the smartwatches, they're inferring and they're interpolating or extrapolating a lot of the data. To what extent are you doing that too?
Yeah. So it is a Gen 1 device. So I think I want to set people's expectations that if they decide to get it, it is a Gen 1 device. There's always going to be things that can be better. That said, we did a little bit of research and looked at Aura Gen 1 device. We're like, wow, does anybody remember that thing? That thing was huge. And so we feel like for a Gen 1 device, we're really happy with a combination of the best of both worlds. So I think it looks stylish. It performs well as an earbud. And it does a pretty good job of the EEG signal itself. I say pretty good because, look, I came from the clinical world. I've been publishing papers on EEG with a wire across the head, and we're able to get almost equivalence of polysomnography with our clinical device. But it is interesting when you take that wire off and you only have single channel in each ear, you just don't have as much different spatial separation from where the signal is being acquired and where the reference is. And that makes it teasing out the signal pretty challenging. Again, you can do it. We have done it, but it's not the same as even the paper we just published, which has a wire across the head and then a box that fits in the pocket. So I think that it is good enough to detect slow waves. It is good enough to give you some broad sleep classification. Interestingly enough, it is giving us heart rate through the accelerometer. So one thing that we're excited about and we're going to build into the next generation of software, not hardware, next generation of software is going to be taking in essentially HRV as an additional metric. Though we're not using PPG for that. We're not using light sensor. There's a signal cardioballistogram that's essentially, there's just very slight movement when the heart's beating, right? And you can pick up that with the accelerometer that we have in there and the gyrometer, which is there too. And so that will make, I think, the sleep algorithms even more accurate. I will say we de-emphasize the diagnostic side. So I wouldn't want people to be surprised in that with Whoop and Aura, they get all the stages of sleep. You had the REM and you had deep and you had light and things like that. That's fine. That's their choice. That leads to its own set of problems. And in 2023, I was at a sleep conference, World Sleep, and we had people concerned about not just our device, but a bunch of devices. They're like, there's something called orthosomnia that we're starting to see more of in the clinic. People are obsessing about their rings and their numbers. And, oh, my REM's too low. And sleep medicine professionals are like, what are you talking about? I have no idea if this ring can actually detect REM. And even if it did, don't obsess about your REM. So we have shied away from giving too much information. I had the privilege of participating in something called the DIME. It's a digital medicine society that focused on what are the objective measures of sleep for sleep researchers. And they focused all on things like the sleep latency time, wake after sleep onset, things that just relate to basically wake versus sleep. And the earbud does a really good job of that, wake versus sleep. It does do N3, but for example, we haven't found a model that does REM and N3 well. You can either point the model towards REM and it will do that, or you can point the model towards N3 and it'll do that, but we don't have both. And so that's why when you get the device, you'll see things like how many slow waves you had, when did you fall asleep, did you wake up, but you won't see, oh, here's my REM score that you see. And again, we're okay with that. We actually think it's probably better to not give so much of that information to the consumer.
Yeah, really. I definitely see that happening, and especially biohackers online, everything like this, Brian Johnson and stuff like this. Oh, I perfected my sleep. I think there's a lot more people like that. Okay, so what about, and you did mention some other applications, heart rate variability. Are there other neurological disorders that might interest you? So like epilepsy, depression, Alzheimer's, ADHD, concussion, maybe even?
Yes. So we're doing active research in a few of those areas. So we've got active research in Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment. So Emory has a brain health center, and Alan Levy is a world-renowned scholar. He's on our scientific board. And so they have about 50 of the clinical devices, and they have about, I think, 10 to 15 devices that are wireless. And so they're comparing the wired devices versus the wireless in their populations that have basically, it's very interesting. The study, they have dyads and one healthy and one non-healthy. And so they can kind of see the healthy brain against the partner's non-healthy brain for mild cognitive impairment. And so we're trying to track disease progression with the earbuds. So can we, that study is not really on intervention. It's more just disease progression tracking. Obviously, another stage would be then once we have that, can you intervene? Does the slow wave stimulation actually slow down the progression of disease, which would be a moonshot in and of itself. But right now, we're just in that diagnostic phase, which is still super cool, because if you could start to diagnose that earlier, a lot of times they say that Alzheimer's is really starting to do its pernicious activity in the brain 20 years before there's clinical symptoms. So if we had some way of tracking that early, it would be huge. So we have research there. We have research in epilepsy. UCB Pharma has funded us for about 3.5, 4 years. And we're coming up on our last stage of the grant, which is producing a seizure forecasting algorithm. So we're very excited about the ability to forecast seizures based on all the data we collected with them over the last 3 or 4 years. So we had the devices in the clinic, both the ear device and the scalp, and we even had intracranial, and we're using all that data to come up with a seizure forecasting algorithm. If that goes well, we can submit that to the FDA and get FDA approval, and that would be amazing. In many ways, Layden, that's what inspired me. The fact that this watch is a consumer device for most people, but for me, it's actually a medical device. Because why? It has atrial fibrillation detection on it. And I got diagnosed with AFib in my 20s. And so when Apple came out and said, oh, the FDA has cleared this algorithm on it, I'm like, all right, I finally have a legit excuse to buy Apple products. And I bought two, right? That I'm always wearing one and charging one. And that's pretty amazing that something with a medical condition like AFib, you can have a cool device, but if you really want to, you can take a measurement. And that's honestly what inspired with the earbuds. I thought, wow, there's 1% of the world has epilepsy. What if they could just have a cool pair of earbuds, but if they really needed to see if something was going on, they were getting an aura, or you had some way of forecasting, they could just do a check. That in many ways was the inspiration of the company when I spun it out.
Yeah, that is really exciting. You're able to control and sense and change things. Is there any possibility to connect with other devices and somehow have something in a network that maybe even causes the even better sleep or something like that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways of, if I can broaden your question a little bit, of what's next, right? How could we make this even better? I think that absolutely we can combine the data, and we do that already with the Apple Health Kit, and we'll do it with the Google Health Kit as well. And we can get some insights. We can get some insights based on how folks are, how many steps they're taking during the day. We can say, hey, based on your number of steps, through having our AI engine integrated into it, we can do correlations. So I'm testing that feature right now. And sure enough, the days I get more than 10,000 steps, I actually get more deep sleep. I get more slow wave. So it's super interesting to find that insight. So the AI powered insights do take advantage of anything that the user has chosen to share with the health kit, be it Google or Apple. So that's cool. The other thing that's really cool is we want to add another stimulation paradigm. So we have started to experiment with some IP that we acquired in 2022 from a company called Nisos. And so Nisos was ear-based. That's the only thing they really had in common with NextSense, was they were ear-based. But they were doing transcutaneous vagal nerve stimulation by putting electrical current into the concha. And that basically activates the peripheral branch of the vagus nerve. So the rest and digest, a lot of people, even consumers and lay people, are focused on, oh, how do I get vagal nerve stimulation? There are a few devices out there, but NextSense is going to put that into the next generation of earbuds. So that is super cool, because what that does is it allows you to trigger that rest and digest. You can, when we did our first set of studies of this in 2023, we published a paper and presented it at an EarConf conference, and we showed that we can affect HRV through vagal nerve stimulation in the ear. And that, if you remember what we talked about earlier in terms of our finding, if you can get into the rest and digest parasympathetic activation before bed, you're more likely to have deeper sleep. You'll be more responsive to the stimulus. So having TVNS before you go to bed, we think will be a great paradigm. So we are planning that. We're applying for an ARPA-H grant. ARPA-H is this amazing program that is funding companies and academic organizations. And they just put out 2 weeks ago something they call the REST proposal, and it's all about sleep and modulation. And so we're super excited to submit for ARPA-H and try to get funding to create sort of the ultimate device, right? That is doing both electrical stimulation, auditory stimulation. It's doing HRV through, we would, in that next gen device, we would go ahead and put PPG in there just so we would have another modality. We could put temperature in there, and then we would have EEG, and it would just be amazing, right? You would have, we're lacking analogies. At X, a lot of times they talk about building the tricorder from Star Trek. Not a huge Star Trek fan myself. I did like it. More of a Star Wars guy. But the tricorder could just diagnose anything. You get a little bit of that diagnosing if you have all those sensors in there. But then I don't have the analogy for like how you could regulate and modulate. So we'll have to work on that one. But we know it'll be super cool.
Yeah, that's exciting. And really, this ultimate wearable to rule them all, the tricorder, it is interesting. I've had, I think, between 3 and 5 vagal nerve stimulator companies and devices and wellness companies on the show. And actually recently too, this year, the last few months, it's been, I think you're the third one. But so what do you think sets you apart? And also, why do you think there is so much interest in this?
Yeah, I think one thing, and again, I don't know any of the specific companies, and so I'm not going to say specifically against any one particular company, but I would say we are shipping, right? It is very hard to go from a project at Google to making 15,000 of these devices. We have manufactured 5,000 of these devices. We've sold 2,700. We're waiting for the other ones to come over from China. So we're out of stock at the moment. Probably by the time this gets live, it will be in stock. So that's good. But yeah, so I think that one, we know how to take something from the lab and actually put it into consumers' hands. And do not underestimate how difficult that is. Lots of props to people that are eager and have prototypes and have seed funding. I've been there. I know what that was like. I loved that phase, but it's super hard to actually get it in the world. So that's number one. Like, we know how to get something in the world. Number two is we took advantage of a distressed company. So sometimes they say it's really good to start a company in tough times. And maybe that's because you can hire great talent, which we've been able to do, but you can also pick up assets. And so Nisos had 30 million of funding and all the patents and all the IP that went into that. And then it basically, due to the way that they set the parameters during the clinical trials, they failed to beat placebo. And obviously I did my diligence and found out that there were parameters that they could have used that they just didn't test. And so I was able to acquire all that assets and trade secret and IP for a very low price, and then validate it with new parameters to know that we can beat placebo. So that I think is good too, that we didn't have to build a whole company and spend $30 million to figure that out. Right? We took advantage of somebody else's pathway. And so that is super helpful that we have that. And then I think the third thing is, you mentioned, what about it? Why is it popular? I think it's because people have seen vagal nerve stim. It can do a lot of things. Some people think Kevin Tracy will get a Nobel Prize because he showed the link between the vagus nerve and inflammation. And inflammation, for a lot of people, is at the root of so many of our diseases, right? You have so many autoimmune diseases, even depression has been linked to inflammation. And so if you can basically down-regulate, like I think one of the theories is just, we didn't evolve to be in this stressful of a situation. Our system is we're just too amped. We're running with too much caffeine, too much stimulation, too much of the internet, too much of AI, just too much. And so we're in this constant state of stimulation, and then the body starts to get inflamed. It just gets hot. It runs hot. It's the vagus nerve's job to provide that balance. And so if you can get a little bit of technology to positively influence the vagus nerve, to give it a little bit of a boost so that it can downregulate, then it seems like a lot of health benefits might follow. And I think that's why you see a lot of interest in it. And I know that's what was behind Nisos's vision, right? Nisos was founded by Konstantinos, and a very successful entrepreneur. He started an invasive vagal nerve stimulation, took that public, and then thought, hey, I want to do this non-invasively. So I think absolutely the right idea, absolutely the right modality. It's just, it does take some experimentation to find those right parameters. And when you do, I think you can tackle things like depression. So we have FDA breakthrough for postpartum depression, thanks to the Nisos acquisition. So they had gotten postpartum depression study launched, and it had a therapeutic effect. There was no sham in that study, but it showed a significant therapeutic effect that the FDA got breakthrough. You have things like depression, you have things like migraine, which has been shown to be effectively mitigated by TVNS. You have rheumatoid arthritis, the largest prescribed drug in the world, coming in for RA. So I think you're seeing a lot of that on your podcast because investors see it as panacea. Nothing's a panacea, but it really does seem like in today's stressful world, if you have a way to downregulate the body, good things happen. And we hope to take all the great work that Konstantinos and his team did in Nisos and use the ARPA-H money that we have to put it into a single device and probably ship that in 2028.
Yeah, exciting. Very cool. I'm wishing you lots of luck. If people want to get this out of stock device, how do they get this in their ear?
Yeah, go to nextsense.io. We can create a code for your listeners and put that in the show notes, and we'll have more in stock by right after 4th of July. If you're listening to this after 4th of July, then there shouldn't be any stock issues.
Excellent. Thank you so much, JB.
Thank you, Layden. Thanks for having me.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.